everyone, on today's episode, we've got a continuation of the conversation we were having last week with Ben Armstrong from Microsoft. So if you recall, last week we were talking about Azure Kubernetes Service running on Azure Stack HCI, and of course, no conversation with Ben Armstrong would be complete without talking about Hyper-V, so that's what this week's episode focuses on. We're going to talk about what's new in Hyper-V, what features Ben is most excited about, and most interestingly to many of our listeners, what is going on with Hyper-V Server. Coming up next on the DOJO podcast. Well, like I said, we're going to pivot to Hyper-V. I have just a few Hyper-V questions here for you before we, ride off into the sunset and call this episode a, done and over with. But the first one I want to just kind of queue up for you. And, you can answer this however you want, right? And I'd be doing our viewers a disservice by not asking you this question. I guess, what cool stuff in Hyper-V, maybe it, I know that we always kind of have to dance around confidential information and NDAs, right? But is there anything in the pipeline for Hyper-V, or maybe recently has come out that you're really excited about?
Yeah. So, and to give people a bit of detail and history on what's going on here. A lot of anyone who's familiar with Hyper-V knows that we built it first as a on-premise virtualization solution.
Yep.
And then we started focusing more and more on Azure, and the feature list for the on-premise folk kind of dwindled down as we spent more time focusing on Azure.
Right.
And one of the things that actually makes me really happy is over the last, I'm going to say 2 years, we've actually been having a lot of really great conversations with the Azure Stack HCI team, with my good friend Cosmos, where Cosmos has been absolutely beating the drum for we have to deliver cool new features for VMs on-prem.
Right.
And we've been working closely with them. And there's a couple of really cool things in the pipeline. One of the ones, and some of these are a bit subtle, but I think they're really cool. One of the ones that recently came out, which I love, is that in the latest Azure Stack HCI, we now have a feature called dynamic processor compatibility.
That's a nice one.
Now, yeah, this is really cool because to give the details for people who aren't familiar, if you're running your workloads in VMs, and you care about them, then you care about live migration.
Yep.
You care about, you want to be able to use cluster-aware updating. You want to be able to do load balancing. You want to be able to move them around without stopping them running. So live migration is really important. But one of the challenges we have is, how do you do that if you're running in a cluster where the processors are slightly different? Because that happens,
Yep.
Maybe you had a cluster that you grew and you got a new server. Maybe, you had a server fail and you needed to get a replacement one, and the one that you got from the OEM has a slightly different processor in it. Well, we have the challenge that just from the Intel architecture point of view,
Right.
There's a whole bunch of software out there that when it starts running, it looks at the processor and it assumes that ain't going to change.
Right.
And this is a really challenging one to deal with. Now, VMware deals with this by having this really complicated UX where you have to choose the processor family of what you want to run on. And when we first built Hyper-V, we were like, we don't like that. That's too complicated. And so we just had this simple checkbox of enable processor compatibility, which was great when we first released Hyper-V. The problem is that as time has gone on, in order for that checkbox to work, it has moved further and further away from where you're at.
Right.
So right now, today, if you check that box, we functionally make your processor the equivalent of a drum roll. Let's see if you remember this, a Pentium D.
I seem to remember. It takes you back quite a ways. Yep.
Quite a ways. Now, when we first released Hyper-V, like Pentium D was just the bottom end of the processor line, so it wasn't that big of a deal.
Right.
Taking a modern Xeon with 1 million cores and being like, forget a third of your instructions, you're a Pentium D, is not great. And so what we did was we built this feature where you can turn it on, and now what happens is we don't ask you to like get out your Intel manual and know all the different families and so on. We don't cut you back to an old processor version. Instead, what we do is we go out and we just survey, hey, what are the capabilities of all the processors in this cluster? We find the lowest common denominator and we set that to be what the processor level is. So that's really cool.
That's a nice feature.
The next one that's come along is we're doing a bunch of work to enable direct access to GPUs and virtual machines while they're clustered.
That'll be really cool.
Yeah, that's a big one because like for ages it's been like you can have this really cool GPU access, or you can have higher availability. You can't have both.
Right.
And no one likes that trade-off.
Right.
So that's another one. Next one, and this is like a little bit tangential to Hyper-V, but I'm super excited for it, is we've been making a bunch of investments to make software-defined networking easier. And software-defined networking is simultaneously really powerful and used by no one because it's too hard and too confusing. We have a bunch of changes coming in Azure Stack HCI to make it far easier to use, far harder to shoot yourself in the foot. So I'm really excited for that. The final one is something that I'm really excited for, and there's a twist in the story coming at the end, which is going to make you laugh. And this is we launched a preview of this. We talked about this at last Ignite. We've got a preview right now, and that is the Arc provisioned virtual machines.
Okay. Yep.
So this is a really cool technology that we're bringing out, where you can take an Azure Stack HCI deployment, connect it and register it through Arc, and you can then provision virtual machines on your server in your data center through the Azure portal. And you can monitor them through the Azure portal. And you can use ARM templates, and you can use all the tooling and so on that exists for that. Now, I love this for two reasons. The first reason why I love it is the staging ground for a bunch of cool stuff that we're going to do that I'm not allowed to talk about yet because it hasn't been disclosed.
Makes sense. Yep.
The second reason why I love it is we hide this all from you. We're just like Arc provisioned virtual machines. And if you use it, we tell you this process to set up the Arc resource bridge.
Right.
The Arc resource bridge just happens to be an alternate name for AKS on premises, because what's actually happening is we have built the ability to do Kubernetes managed Hyper-V VMs. And the way we are doing the Arc connection is the Arc resource bridge is actually a special, you can basically think of it as a specialized deployment of AKS on-prem, where I talked about we have development teams, we're building stuff. And this is an example of something that we've built on AKS on-prem, where under the covers, that is all Kubernetes. And I am hoping this year to find some time, because you can actually if you do some poking around, you can actually you can go into AKS on Azure Stack HCI and use like Kubernetes tools. And if you give it the right commands to say like, give me a VM, it'll go like, okay. And it'll go provision a Hyper-V VM for you, which is pretty cool.
Like you said, there's a
So it all
twist to
comes
that
together,
one.
Andy. It all comes together.
We've come full circle. We've come full circle
Exactly.
now. Oh, that's really cool. I was not aware of that one either. So that's two things I've learned during this talk. That's awesome. Very cool.
Yeah, no, I'm actually we have some really cool ideas for bringing new management experiences, bringing new VM experiences through Kubernetes enabled platform. So stay tuned. We're gonna this year's gonna be fun.
Yeah, it's sounding like definitely something that needs to be watched. Need to keep an eye on it. So sounds like we may have to have you back later in the year to talk about it some more.
Oh, I have so many fun things that I can't tell you about right now. I'm super excited.
That's cool. Well, I'll definitely have to have you back now. So, well, cool. There's one final thing I want to touch on before we wrap up. And this is kind of selfishly a question I wanted to talk about a little bit, because there's a lot of folks in the Altero and the Hornet security community here that keep asking this question, and that has to do with Hyper-V Server, right? The free SKU of Hyper-V, and the fact that SKU granted, the 2019 version of it's going to be around until what's end of support, 2028 or something. It's going to be out there for a while. But there's a lot of people concerned about the removal of the Hyper-V Server SKU in Server 2022. Now, from what I've read online and what I've seen is the suggestion for those people that were historically using the free SKU is to go check out Azure Stack HCI, right? But they're concerned with, hey, we've got a free SKU, maybe they're using it to run open source workloads, whatever, that $10 per host per month for Azure Stack HCI is tough for some of them to swallow. I guess the question I'm asking here is just kind of, do you have any thoughts around that? I'm sure you can't give an official statement, right? But
let me. I will give both the official statement, but let me give a little behind the scenes here.
Sure.
For you. So for people who aren't familiar, Hyper-V Server is a SKU of Windows Server that was based on Windows Server Core. It was a stripped down version of Windows Server. It had all the roles removed except for Hyper-V and a couple of core roles that supported it. We made it available for free.
Yep.
But it didn't include any guest licenses for Windows Server, unlike Standard Edition and Data Center that come with various licenses for Windows Server. And we did this to make it easier for people to evaluate, try out Hyper-V, and for people who are in these super cost sensitive scenarios to be able to use Hyper-V.
Yep.
Now, it may not surprise you to hear that we didn't make much money on a free product.
Right. Makes sense.
But at the same time, it didn't cost us much to keep it running. The first version of Hyper-V Server that we came out with was actually Windows Server 2008 or 2.
Right.
And pretty much every time we've gone through a planning process for Windows Server, there's been this conversation about what do we do with Hyper-V Server? Does it make sense for us to keep on doing this? And every time we do it, we'd go off and we'd do the business analysis.
Right.
And it would always come back and be we have a pocket of people who are using it for open source, and we have a pocket of people who are using it for desktop, and we probably have some people who are using it because they're dirty, rotten pirates. But there are not too many of those. Right. Because honestly, if you're that sort of person, you're probably pirating Data Center anyway.
Right.
and they'd be like, there are these people using it, but it doesn't really make us much money at the end of the day. But then the math would come down as like, but it's practically zero engineering effort to like continue cranking it out. So like on the balance, fine, let's keep on doing it.
Right.
And that was kind of the way that it existed. And we went into Windows Server 2019 planning. That conversation happened.
Yep.
And we were like, fine, like it's just keep on doing it. It's fine. We got to like, and this is the behind the curtains bit. We got to like 2 months before we were going to release Windows Server 2019, and there was a bug fix that went in that just broke Hyper-V Server.
Oh no!
Just broke it. Now, for people who remember, Hyper-V Server Windows Server 2019 did not ship until like 6 months
right
after, because we spent 8 months of engineering effort.
Oh, for a free product
to get it. Yeah. To like we sunk a lot of engineering effort into something that we knew we were not making a dime back on.
Right.
And
wow.
When we got to the end of that, we kind of post-mortem it and we realized that like, oh, like this is now like a really old product. Like, yes, we've been refreshing it, but like the infrastructure for building it is really old. And we're like, this is gonna happen again. And in fact, it's gonna be more frequent moving forward. And so we kind of had to make the tough call where we were like investing the engineering effort to continue to maintain Hyper-V Server as it is, as Windows Server continues to evolve. Because like, if you look at Windows Server 2022 compared to Windows Server 2008 R2, like a
right.
very, very different piece.
No comparison.
So we're like, and so that's where we made the tough call, and it was a tough call to be like, okay, we're not gonna continue doing it this way. Now, with that said, we're very aware of the usage patterns that people have. Like every time we've done this, we've gone out and we've talked. And Azure Stack HCI is the platform we're investing heavily in.
Yep.
And we want Azure Stack HCI to address those needs. Now, does it address those needs today? No. And we know that. Right. We know that there's some set of people where like it'll address those needs, but we're also aware that there are things that we need to work on to make it make more sense. So, for instance, like not making any promises, but like one thing that there's been a lot of discussion about is right now Azure Stack HCI is only supported in a clustered deployment. A lot of people who are using Hyper-V Server were using it for just a single server.
Right. Right.
And so we're having a conversation about like, okay, what does it look like to do a single server Azure Stack HCI? And we're having a lot of these conversations and to figure out like, okay, how do we enable it for price sensitive folk? So one, I want to like with all of that said and done, kind of bringing it back to the top. The two things that I want your audience to hear out of all of this. The first one is we know that people loved Hyper-V Server.
Right.
Like it's not that we're unaware. It's not that we're like, no one uses this thing and it's dumb, kill it. No. We know that people used Hyper-V Server. We like at absolute minimum, we have the download numbers. We know how much it was getting downloaded, but we have been out talking to people and we understand the use cases and we know that that's there.
Right.
We know that Azure Stack HCI does not meet all those use cases today. We want to have a solution for these folk in the future. It is on our radar. It is something that we're working on. Unfortunately, continuing to maintain Hyper-V Server the way it was just wasn't going to be viable long term. So,
I figured that was the case. I'm really glad we got a chance to kind of talk about that. And I really appreciate you kind of giving us the behind the scenes look on that too, because, I had people on webinars. We did one webinar. I don't remember what it was. We were talking about what's new in Windows Server 2022. That's what the webinar was on. And I want to say I had to have gotten like 11 questions on like, hey, what's going on with Hyper-V Server? And I'm like, I don't know the exact answer, guys, but I'm like, I've been dealing with Microsoft, as a customer, as an MVP for X number of years now. And I'm like, the one thing I can tell you is that they don't do something for no reason, right? I'm like, there's a reason why they've made this decision. I'm just like, I don't know what it is, but it is what it is, right? So, no, that's really cool that we kind of got the behind the scenes on that. So I really appreciate that.
And I also will add into that, to everyone who has been yelling and screaming about Hyper-V Server, continue to, please. Like, we are listening. Like, we're not always able to react. Like, and a lot of times, and this is exactly where we're at right now. A lot of times we're like, yeah, that's hard. like it's gonna be a hard one to figure out. But like, do know that your feedback is heard and it is appreciated. Yeah,
appreciate that. Yeah, definitely. So, which brings up my final item here. If people want to get a hold of you after listening to the episode, if they have maybe a follow-up question, what's the best way for them to reach out to you?
So as we were discussing before we started recording, not LinkedIn. I'm terrible at LinkedIn. Something I've done my entire life and has yet to bite me. And I will say, easy. You can email me, ben.armstrong@microsoft.com. Andy can attest, I don't always respond, but you're free to email me. If I don't respond, nag me. That's fine.
But you do respond. You do eventually respond. Yep. So
yeah, I do take some nagging sometimes.
I will come to your defense on that because you do ultimately respond.
The other thing, I don't have the URL handy. I'll share it with you afterwards, Andy, and maybe we can get linked to the podcast.
Yeah, sure.
We do actually have a newly launched community voice for AKS on-prem, which
nice.
is submit feedback, vote up other people's feedback. The other thing is I am, for better or for worse, a big Twitter user. So at Ben Armstrong. Feel free to follow me, ping me on DMs. My DMs are always open. So those are a couple of ways.
Sounds good. And for those of you listening, I'll be sure to get those into the show notes. Depending on the platform, it might be underneath this video, it might be above it, to the side. Somewhere around this video, we'll be sure to include that information. Well, with that, Ben, I've held you for over an hour here. I know you're a busy guy. I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your insights. It's always fun talking to you. And I always get pumped up about all this new technology whenever I got you on the line. So I'm going to have to go deploy AKS on my Azure Stack HCI cluster in the basement here at some point.
Absolutely. And we definitely need to do this again because we have so much cool stuff coming this year. I am super excited for 2022. It's going to be an awesome year.
I'm looking forward to it. Yeah, definitely. I'll be reaching out later this year and we'll have you back on the show. So really appreciate it. So
awesome. And thank you.
Yeah, definitely. And for those of you watching, thanks for tuning in on this episode of the DOJO podcast. As always, we love doing these for you guys. And, be sure to check out our other educational IT content. You can go to altero.com/dojo and pick your poison. It's getting easier to say what we don't cover on that blog than what we do cover. We've got a new M365 dojo that's coming here soon. Soon to be followed by an Azure-specific dojo as well. And, of course, we always have the classic, Hyper-V, VMware, MSP related dojos. We have a backup and DR dojo as well. Like I said, it's getting easier to say what we don't talk about. So be sure to check those out. Be sure to check out our social media handles as well. Again, somewhere around this video. And with that, I'll let you guys go. Have a great day. We'll talk to you again next time. Thanks. Hey everyone, it's Andy again. Hey, thanks for watching the episode today. Hope you enjoyed it. One thing I wanted to leave you with, we've been talking a lot about Azure Stack HCI, Hyper-V, hybrid cloud, and a lot of the recent episodes. Wanted to let you know that on March 23rd, we are running a webinar that talks about all things Azure Stack HCI and hybrid cloud. Now, you can register for that webinar by clicking on the link in the description of this episode. And if you're watching or listening to this episode after March 23rd, you can use that same link to watch the webinar on demand. So hope you enjoy it. Again, we hope to see you for a future episode of the podcast. Have a great day.